Or is everything, in a way, predetermined? Can someone have the insight to look into the future and see what will happen next? According to the following stories about psychics and their predictions, there's a chance that the answer is a resounding yes. But of course, it's not as easy as that, especially considering any of these tales can be fake. Which of these three tales are woven in truth, and which are products of our imaginations? That's for you to decide, whether these stories are fact or fiction. The line that divides the factual from the unreal has long since blurred. The tales we once thought fantastical, now implanted as true. To decipher verity from the imagined, you must break from the ordinary and consider a universe where the outlandish prevails. Can you expand your mind to see beyond our perceived reality? Can you decide what's fact or fiction? Are psychics solely for entertainment? Or do they have some latent ability to foresee the future? If you ask Jacqueline Walsh, she'd likely attest that there's some truth behind what they say. After being pressured by her girlfriends to go, she gave in one day and sat with Madame Tanya. It was an hour of her life that she would never forget. She knew I was going to become a nurse. Knew it. Not an ounce of hesitation in her voice. And she was right. I was in the second year of my science and nursing degree. It was eerie, but I wondered if somehow I gave it away when we first sat down together. Or maybe it was just a lucky guess. As we got onto the topic of kids, she wasn't nearly as chipper as she was when we started. The month before, I had received abnormal test results that led to a discussion with my surgeon about cervical surgery. Of course, he warned me that it may make it impossible for me to have children. And she knew it. When she brought up difficulties about getting pregnant, I remember she just put her hand on mine and we were silent for a moment. The air was already heavy, but when she told me to ask her a question, I didn't even hesitate to ask if my boyfriend and I would stay together, kind of testing her. We had such a good relationship, I didn't doubt that he was the one. But then she said it, and it really stung to hear. He's yours now, but not forever. As Jacqueline repeated the words, tears started to well in her eyes. Clearly, it would be a difficult story to tell, but she was adamant about pushing forward. With a choke from deep within her throat, she continued. I tried not to think of it after, but it stuck with me. You know, you try to take a psychic reading at face value just as entertainment, but I couldn't shake that ominous feeling. For 9 years, I lived with those words floating in the back of my head, teasing me in my sleep every so often. Then one summer, I came home early to find him sprawled on the floor. I could see him breathing, but no matter how loud I called to him, he didn't move. Panicked, I rushed to him, and the first thing I saw was the needle still clutched in his hand. He was shooting heroin. Apparently, he had been for months. Of course, we split up. I pushed him to go to rehab, and he promised he would, if only to get me back. But 9 months later, he was dead from an overdose. I never told him what the psychic said. Maybe I should have. I know I'll remember my time with Madame Tanya forever. Poor Jacqueline. A love ended too soon. Or maybe a love that never existed. You decide, and let us know what you think in the comments section and on-screen poll cards. Although they generally got along, Dane's wife always complained he could try harder to bond with his 5-year-old son. So he took him to one of his favorite spots, the tracks. It was here that he found his son to have a peculiar yet advantageous ability. When Dane first sat down, he did so with a glimmer of excitement in his eye. He was anxious to tell his story, so much so that he skipped the formal introductions and got right to the point. It's not that I didn't get along with Bentley, we just enjoyed different things. But when my wife implored me to spend more time with him, I figured we could bond over something I really enjoyed. The tracks were pretty quiet that day. Before we even got there, I knew who I wanted to bet on: Black Pearl. Yeah, it's a cheesy movie reference, but boy did he live up to the legend in the film. He was a favorite, and the payout wasn't going to be grand, but it was typically a guaranteed win. Bentley, however, just kept carrying on about Martha's steed. The odds were worse, statistically impossible actually. The horse had never won a race of this size, and she was the only female in the pack. But that also meant a bigger payout. So I entertained the kids' pick, threw $20 down, figuring it couldn't hurt. I'm not a huge gambler, and besides, the smile on Bentley's face was well worth it. With a smile plastered on his face, Dane continued. Wouldn't you know it, round the final bend comes Martha's steed, leaving the pack in her dust as she received a standing ovation from the spectators. I figured Bentley just liked the name Martha or was throwing a name out at random. But when I went to place a second bet, he very confidently suggested Golden Fleece. The odds weren't terrible, but they weren't great either. And that's when things got weird. I couldn't believe it. His pick won in a photo finish, just barely beating out the second place horse by the length of his nose. It had to be a coincidence. I know my son knew nothing about odds and statistics, but I'd figure I'd give him a third try. He chose, I bet, and from a third race, I walked away a winner, and then a fourth, a fifth, and finally a sixth bet. All underdog picks, and all without hesitation. There was still a race or two left, but it was already getting late, so we decided to call it a night. Once we got back home, I talked to Bentley about our night at the tracks. I asked how he knew which horses to pick, and all he could say was, I had a feeling. Out of guilt, we never went back to the tracks after that, and I put the money in a savings account for Bentley. It probably didn't matter anyway. I've since asked Bentley to make friendly predictions, and all he says is, I don't have that weird feeling anymore. Is it impossible to believe that someone like 5-year-old Bentley could correctly predict 6 underdog bets in a row? What are the odds that all 6 favored horses all lost that day? Perhaps Bentley overheard other people who had insider tips talk about the horses beforehand. While you debate in the comments section about the validity of this story, let's introduce you to Julia Chen. She went to a local psychic seeking answers about her career. Instead, she received a worrying prediction that she didn't know how to handle. It wasn't the ideal place to live, but Julia couldn't afford much else, at least not on the small salary she was still earning. 5 years of dedicated service, and there didn't seem to be any reward in sight. Not a promotion, not a holiday bonus, nothing. That's when she decided she needed a second opinion on her career. Her family was out, all far too wrapped up in their perfect lives to pay any mind to Julia. Her friends were worse off, and not ones that should give out advice. So she turned to the only thing she could think of. Chip Frazier had opened up his shop years earlier, but Julia never had much of a need for a psychic. But finally finding herself lost, she caved. Her first visit to Chip was more of a warm-up. She started easy on him, and he delivered, warning her to watch her back right tire 2 days before it blew on her. Knowing he knew what he was doing, Julia returned, this time ready to ask the question that really mattered. I just feel like I'm stuck. Do I stay? Do I go? Do I have any future at my job anymore? It was a reasonable question, one that Chip had heard many times before. So he did what he did best and listened to the world around him, pinpointing what was relevant to Julia's life. It was her career that she came to him for, but he would send her off with something much different. Though he had much to tell her, something struck him as concerning. "I hear water in the walls of your apartment." Chip had said a lot during their second session, but that was all Julia could latch onto. What did he mean by water in the walls? Was it code for something? Julia went about her business as usual, eventually letting Chip's strange vision fade. Then, 2 months later, she found out what he was referring to. While at work one day, an electrical fire ignited Julia's apartment, starting from within the walls and spreading to neighboring units. When she was finally able to step inside and assess what was lost, something peculiar caught her eye. Within her hollowed-out walls, she could see the water dripping. Chip's premonition came back to her immediately. Well, Chip's prediction would have come in handy had Julia been an electrician. But it's strange nonetheless, no? Maybe it's not, especially if it's one of our false tales to throw you off track. Why not leave us a comment with your thoughts and vote now on screen? As we get to the bottom of which stories were true and which were false, I feel it's important to say, while we're labeling actual accounts of psychics as true, all psychic readings should always be taken with a grain of salt. Are you ready to find out if you can decipher between fact or fiction? Let's look back at tonight's 3 stories and find out which were born from reality and which were fabrications of the imagination. Let's start with Jacqueline's story, that of the prediction of her doomed relationship. Do you think this was a real person's own experiences or the creation of my imagination? If you predicted it as true, then maybe you have a future in the psychic reading industry. The story comes from a BuzzFeed user named Jen, who claims a psychic predicted the tragic ending of her everlasting love. How do you feel about the story of Bentley and his winning streak? Do you think this is your typical story of beginner's luck? Sorry, there is no Bentley. This story was penned by our own writers. Finally, let's look at Julia Chen's wet walls. Was Chip's prediction real or something we had fun throwing together? Would you believe it if I said this came from another BuzzFeed user? This time, a girl named Bridget shared her alleged story of an accurate psychic prediction. Bridget also claimed that her anonymous psychic was able to say what town she would eventually move to. Many years later, there she was, starting a whole new life. How well did you do in tonight's video? Did you look past the deception of our world and define the off-blurred line that struggles to separate lies from the truth? Let us know in the comment section below. And should you find the urge to test your perceptions again, be sure to subscribe and join us next time when we ask you to decide what's fact or fiction.